Welcome to the video lecture series of Narajole Raj College. I'm PARAMITA MONDAL, Assistant Professor and Head Department of English and IQAC Coordinator, Narajole Raj College. Today we shall be doing Rashundari Devi's Amar Jivan from paper C12 Women's Writing for 5th semester English Honours under Vidyasagar University. Rashundari Devi's Amar Jivan, as we know, is the first autobiography by an Indian woman published in 1876. It was also the first autobiography by a Bengali author, the next being that by Devendranath Thakur, published almost 20 years later. So, when Rashundari Devi published Amar Jivan, which she did in 2 volumes, she was an octogenarian woman. She was in her 80s, and as the introduction to the translation of Amar Jivan follows, we come to know that Jyotirindranath Thakur, that is Rabindranath Thakur's elder brother, happened to be a bit critical about the proposition of an octogenarian woman writing an autobiography and publishing it in the last decades of the 19th century. What he expected from Rashundari Devi is rather explicitly stated by him in his observation, in the remarks that he made. He was expecting, as most male critics of women's writing would do, to find nothing unusual in Rashundari Devi's narration. In fact, he meant to question the very rationale of Rashundari Devi's attempt to record the story of her life. But he was indeed very candid, and he was very committed in admitting that his expectations were rather thwarted. The presumptions that he had made about Rashundari Devi's writing and her content were proved invalid because he was constantly surprised by the honesty and the integrity that Rashundari Devi professed in each and every line of the autobiography. In fact, Jyotirindranath suggests that he had meant to underline the few words or sentences that would be of some value in this autobiography written by a woman in her 80s. And later, he admits very frankly that this exercise proved futile because each and every sentence of the autobiography seemed to be valuable. Thereby, the whole task, therefore, was rendered useless. So, this comes as a form of validation and asserts and attests the importance of Rashundari Devi's writing in the history of women's writing in India as well as women's activism. Now, Rashundari Devi was writing in the late 19th century, and she was in no way associated with the women's movement or with feminism, so to speak, which was a later formulation. So, what is the role of Rashundari Devi, or what is her contribution to the a wide range of feminist literature and thought and theory that we tend to focus on? So, Rashundari Devi's text has been subjected to interpretation and analysis by later theorists, and we tend to apply the different theoretical formulations, the different feminist ideological formations while reading and analyzing her text and while interpreting it. So Rashundari Devi was not in herself a propagandist of any sort. She did not associate herself with the women's movement or with any form of feminist mobilization, so to speak. What Rashundari Devi does and what we have in the select sections prescribed in the university's syllabus is that she deals with some basic ideas that define the feminist agenda, that define the feminist propaganda. So there are very core issues that are woven into the texture of her text, of the narrative that she presents. And these are some of the ideas or issues that we would analyze as we move on with the text, with reading the text. So there are four compositions prescribed in our syllabus: the third, the fourth, and the fifth, the sixth. So in the third and the fourth composition, what we have is basically an account of Rashundari Devi getting married as a child bride and her experiences at her in-laws' place. So she verbalizes her experiences in with a lot of honesty, with a lot of commitment as a writer, and she does not. She makes it a point to deal with the nuances of the emotional nuances that she was experiencing at the time of her marriage, that she was experiencing at the moment of her departure from her maternal home. What the question, a very significant question that she raises at the beginning of the text, is why she should be identified uh, by her father's name. So, her quest for asserting her maternal identity is an idea that we closely associate with the notions of matrilineality in uh, feminist mobilization, in feminist theory, and in feminist formulations. So she tries to recognize her maternal lineage and repeatedly presents before her readers the fact that she was brought up by her mother, she was tutored by her mother. So whatever lessons, life lessons she has received were all from her mother. So her mother was solely responsible for her upbringing as a complete human being, as a woman. She inculcated all the values, all the moral education that she has borne throughout her life. This sense of gratitude that she expresses toward her mother is something that motivates the idea of being identified by her mother's name. This is a concern that she represents. This is also a thought that anguishes her, that it is also a thought that causes her immense pain, because with this thought is usually followed by her sense of guilt, by her sense of helplessness at not being able to attend to her mother on her dying bed. She believes that she has failed her filial duty, and that is because she was born as a woman. So she has been very explicit about the fact that she was unable to fulfill the role of a daughter because she had to conform to social expectations, she had to conform to the norm of the or the she had to conform to the idea of discharging her duties as a wife, as a Hindu wife. So on her mother's deathbed, she could not even get the permission to visit her or to be by her side, to comfort her or to console her, or to utter a few last words. This has been a constant regret that has tormented Rashunduri Devi for the rest of her life. So, these are the initial articulations that she begins with: her concern over her identity as being associated with her mother than that of her father. So it is her maternal identity that she upholds, it is her maternal identity that she wishes to validate and valorize. And there is also an implicit idea, an implicit intention of rejecting her paternal identity. So, with this, we move on to the main body of the text, the third composition, that begins with a description of Rashundari Devi's wedding preparations. So, as a child, Rashundari Devi is hardly aware of the fact that these wedding preparations, all the hustle and bustle at her home, is meant to prepare her as a bride. So initially she is very excited, she's very elated, enthusiastic about the idea of there being some sort of festivity at home, of the lights and the decorations being made, the wedding music, and the ambience has completely transformed, and she feels very jubilant over the prospect that is about to unfold. And gradually, she realizes that it is her own wedding that is about to happen. And even if she was feeling very joyful, even if she was feeling rather glad over the wedding preparations, over the music and the decorations, she starts feeling rather despondent, because the overall the ambience that surrounded her was rather quite tragic and grave. All her if, family members, even her mother, her friends, were all grieving the fact that she had to leave after the wedding was over. And she started to gradually realize that something very tragic was about to happen. That is why people were despairing. But then, because of the lightness of being that she embodied at that point in time, her thoughts started fluttering, and she started enjoying the moment very soon. So, we find that when she gets a glimpse of the red sari that she would done, and the jewelry that she would be dressed in, she feels rather happy. And this anticipation, this apprehension that she was feeling a moment ago gradually subsides. So what happens after the wedding preparation is done, after the wedding has happened? Rashundari Devi is hardly aware of the fact that she is a married woman now. She has no idea of the expectations that a society has from a wife, and she is also not aware of the idea of marriage, of the conditions of marriage as such. So, when the moment of departure arrives, when there are whispers that she hears about people talking about somebody leaving, and she is very sure of the fact that it is the guests who need to leave. But then she suddenly realizes that people are discussing now the fact that she has to depart, that she is the one leaving the home on that day. And this makes her even more sad. She is overcome with sorrow, and she starts crying. And there is her mother, and there is also the anecdote that will explain very, very familiar and consistent tone in her narrative in the subsequent sections. That is her dependence on God and her relationship with God. So, what is the source of this idea that God is there to help her through thick and thin, that God is her ultimate savior, that He is there to assist her forever, and she can submit to His will. She is the one executing divine will. So, what is the source of this idea? The idea originates from the words that Rashundari Devi's mother pronounces at the time of her leaving, at the time of her leaving her mother's house, at the moment of her departure. Rashundari Devi's mother frankly instructs her to pray to God and to remember Him and to chant His name, because it is God that and His blessings that will help her overcome all adversities. So she takes these words to heart, and she never wavers from believing in God, just as her mother had instructed. So she is, in a way, executing her mother's will as well, in the form of following the divine dispensation. So, this is how the initial section of the third composition ends, and then we have a description of the journey that she would undertake to reach her in law's place. So, Rashundari Devi is very new to the changed circumstances, and there is the description of the long boat ride that she has to uh, take. The boat ride from her native village, Putajia, to her in law's place, to the village where she would now be living for the rest of her life, that is Ramdia. So she talks about this boat ride and how the motion of the boat was making her uncomfortable, how she was not able to get used to the idea of being surrounded by so many strangers, and how she was constantly looking out for familiar faces. She was constantly waiting to hear familiar voices. And this sense of desperation, this sense of loneliness that encircles her, that surrounds her, that is very heartrending. The way in which she presents the spectacle, the changed scenario, the change of scenes from land over to water and back to land. So this transition for Rashundari is very drastic, and she constantly fails to keep up with the pace of the changes that are taking place in her life. So these transitions keep on happening. The change of spectacle, the change of landscape also happens in due time as the narration progresses. The change of landscape and the description of the changed landscape, that also emerges as part of the narrative. So after the journey comes to an end, Rashundari Devi is on her way to her in law's place, and she makes a very significant statement here. When she is able to spot her in law's place, the house where she has to live now for the rest of her life, she calls it their home, their house, and not her home. So, this reference to the uh, house as being there, as not something not belonging to her, is very significant. Here, Ashundari Devi is trying to make a conscious, a deliberate distinction between the ideas of home and house. So, what makes a house a home? The emotional core of the place where we reside, the emotional core, the essence of the place that we choose to be our abode. What is the idea that Rashundari Devi is communicating? That it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of labor on the part of the woman to get used to the changed circumstances of life. And she is also being, in a way, critical of the social conditions of marriage that force women to adapt to so many changes taking place one after the other, as a part of the as a part of the matrimonial situation. So, what is it that she criticizes here? That the woman has to be identified by the name of people that she hardly knows, that are all strangers to her, that she is completely unfamiliar of, that she has to leave her maternal home or her paternal home, and force herself to adjust to the changed circumstances. She is also critical of the fact that all that she knew to be familiar, all that she had forever held to be dear, would now be lost forever, would now be gone forever, and she will never be able to see her relatives or to have a moment of joy, to share a moment of happiness with her mother, with her friends, with her playmates, and all the rest of her family, the relations that she had so dearly cherished, that she had always nurtured. So she is completely being completely honest in articulating the emotional changes that she was getting exposed to, the changed circumstances that she had to cope with, and how challenging it was for a child bride to get adapted to so much of transition and transformation. So the this section of the third composition is also very significant because it sets the tone of the entire narrative that we would be reading in the next segments. So the uh, situation has changed. Rashundari Devi is no longer her mother's child. She is the wife of a Hindu man, and now she is at her in-laws place, ready to take up the responsibility of the household, to serve the members of this new home that she has to fashion out of this house. So the distinction between the idea of the home and the house is very significant. So it is also as if she's trying to make a commentary on the scope of this transition that women are subjected to. So it is a commentary on the idea of change, why it should be appreciated as a positive change, and what are the significant negatives that we are forced or advised to overlook, and why she is not at peace with the idea of dismissing this sense of discomfort, of dismissing this sense of resentment, her grievance at not being able to reconnect with her past. So there is this conflict, and in a very slight manner, we feel that there is this conflict that Rashundari Devi had experienced as a child, and that had indeed made a very strong impression on her mind. That is what she recollects as a woman in her 80s, and she feels that it is a significant phase, a significant transition that she should document here as part of her autobiography, as part of her life story. So while she remained to be an innocent housewife who was meant to suppress her thoughts or ideas, and to become a part of the silence that society validates, she believes that the art of that the task of narrating this tale, that the task of recording it in words, that the task of verbalizing it would give it an edge, would give it an edge and a validation that she believes her narrative, her story deserves. So she is there making a statement by the very act of writing, by the very act of verbalizing it. So, this vocalization of her experiences as a child bride is very significant, even when we look at it in the context of the history of women's consent with relation to having social relations in marriage, with relation to her sexual agency, with relation to her socio-economic agency. So within the space of the family, within the sphere of domesticity. So this with this signification, we move on to the next section of the third and the fourth composition, where she very vividly describes the change situation in her new home, why it was different, why she was blessed and great and rather grateful to have a very kind and compassionate mother-in-law who supported her, who protected her from many hazards in the initial years of her marriage. But there is also, a recurrence of this sense of anguish that she had experienced. So this anguish is communicated to the readers from time to time. What she uses in the next segment is an image of a caged bird. When she was about to get married, when she was at the ritual of departure that girls have to perform at the end of the marriage, she compared herself to a goat, the sacrificial goat. And in the very next segment, she compares herself again to a caged bird. When she was undertaking the boat ride, she compared herself to a bird, to a caged bird, and this comparison recurs. She repeats it. She compares herself to a caged bird as well as to a fish trapped in a net. So it is also very important that she is using images, she is using symbols from the world of nature as if she is trying to find a resonance there, and she is trying to make her helplessness, to make her lack of agency very, very, she's trying to communicate that idea very distinctly by using these images. There is also a dehumanizing effect that she is constantly experiencing, and that is reflected in her choice of images. She compares herself to a goat. So, a goat is considered to be a lame animal, as an animal which is rather weak, and similarly, she compares herself to a caged bird, a bird that is trapped inside a golden cage or maybe any cage and is unable to move. So, the lack of mobility that is communicated in her choice of image, as well as the fish trapped in a net, caught in a net, that also suggests the lack of mobility. So, the lack of agency, the lack of mobility is something that bothers her a lot. And she is the free spirited girl that she was at her mother's home, that who is constantly struggling to be liberated and finds itself to be in chains every moment of her married life. So, this contrast that she is trying to bring out, that she is trying to address, is in consonance with her choice of images that depict the condition that she finds herself in and how she herself appreciates, interprets her condition, how she perceives it, how she wishes it to be represented. This idea is very important as well. So, the third composition, we find that she is not a woman who complains, she is not a woman who grumbles, but with a lot of dignity, with a lot of sincerity and integrity. She is there making a statement. She is there depicting every emotion that she felt, that she experienced at the time of her marriage. So she has been very, very candid about these different layers of emotions that she confronted at that moment. What happens at the end of the fourth composition is that she very faintly suggests the idea that which makes her account rather revolutionary. So, why is Rashundari Devi's life story so striking? Why is it so unique? What is so remarkable about her achievement is that she is a woman who taught herself to read and write, and she did so not by seeking external help, but by applying her own resources, by mobilizing her own resources. So, what are the strategies that she had to employ in order to accomplish this? So, this is a very significant area that this narrative would cover. And this is also an idea that lies at the core of Rashundari Devi's autobiographical narrative. So, while the act of life writing, or while the act of auto writing is in itself an empowering act, what this text is trying to guide us to is to explore how this act of empowerment begins very early in Rashundari Devi's life. So she shares with her reader that the idea of learning to read and write occurred to her at the age of 14. And that was the moment when she had never ever contemplated anything about receiving an education, because that was not a possibility given the situation of her life. But somehow she tells us that she felt inspired by the idea of being able to read and write. And while the motivation of learning to read and write was purely to be able to read religious texts and scriptures. That was the bottom line. That was the motivation that she had, that she would be able to read the scriptures if she becomes a literate woman, if she engages in literacy, if she empowers herself in that way. But we find that while she was spending her days in her in-laws place, at her in-laws place, and she was trying to learn the ways of discharging her duties as a devoted wife, as a devoted Hindu wife. How did she negotiate these two aspects of her personality? One of being a very duty bound, of being a very dutiful, compliant wife, and the other of being a rebel on her own terms. So she was engaging in a kind of personal protest. The very idea that she nurtured of being able to read and write was an articulation of that private protest that she was about to launch. So, in the fifth composition, in fact, she gives us a very detailed account of this experience, and of the different barriers that she had to overcome. What were the hazards of engaging in the task of learning to read and write within the confines of domesticity, and taking into account all the social taboos that are associated with women's education, and all the censor that she would be subjected to in case her desire is revealed, in case it is disclosed to anybody other than her own self and the divine entity. So it is God that she converses with, it is to God that she expresses her utmost, her deepest, her profoundest desires. And in our next lecture, we would focus more on her relationship with God, and we would also discuss her journey as she learns to read and write on her own. Thank you very much.